9. Esther may be a difficult book to find if you are using a hard copy Bible. It's just before a book of Job, which is before the book of Psalms. It's a relatively short story, but if you can find it, please turn to chapter 9, verse 20. And I will read from there to the end of this chapter. In fact, if you've been following the daily Bible reading, this is tomorrow's portion. I'm taking a day ahead. And Mordecai recorded these things and sent letters to all the Jews who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, both near and far, obliging them to keep the 14th day of the month of Adar, and also the 15th day of the same, year by year, as the days as which the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month that had been turned for them. Here's something that I underline in my Bible: from sorrow into gladness, and from mourning into a holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and gladness, days for sending gifts of food on one another and gifts to the poor. So the Jews accepted what they had started to do and what Mordecai had written to them for Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to destroy them and had cast lots, to crush and to destroy them. But when it came before the king, he gave orders in writing that his evil plan that he had devised against the Jews should return on his own head, and that he and his son should be hanged on the gallows. Therefore they call these days Purim, after the term Pur. Therefore, because of all that was written in this letter, and of what they had faced in this matter, and of what had happened to them, the Jews firmly obligated themselves and their offspring and all who joined them, that without fail they would keep these 2 days according to what was written and at the time appointed every year, that these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation, in every clan, province, and city, and that these days of Purim should never fall into disuse among the Jews, nor should the commemoration of these days cease among their descendants. Then Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail, and Mordecai the Jew gave full written authority, confirming this second letter about Purim. Letters were sent to all the Jews, to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus, in words of peace and truth, that these days of Purim should be observed at their appointed seasons, as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther obligated them, and as they had obligated themselves and their offspring with regard to their fast and their lamenting. The command of Queen Esther confirmed these practices of Purim, and it was recorded in writing. Amen. Well, I read this particular selection out of the entire book of Esther because I think this gives us an idea why this particular book was written and was preserved until these days for the Jews as well as us Christians. And the term that you find here that is still in use is the term Purim. I guess Purim in English could be pronounced in different ways, but it's actually it's a Hebrew background, and when you have the ending like that, it actually is a long I, Purim, so something like that. I'm not a Hebrew scholar, but that little I know. So it's actually a term that refers to 2 days, typically celebrate these days at the end of February or early March, because it's basically going with the Jewish calendar that does change days on the solar calendar. So in the winter time, those 2 days celebrated as Purim because this means a very special time in the collective history of the Jews. This is when they were in deep, deep trouble, the days that were appointed for the destruction of the entire Jewish race. But somehow the turn of events dramatically turned the other way. And on those days, instead of Jews being massacred, turned out to be a time of their deliverance. And the enemies of Jews, particularly characterized in that one person, Haman, they were destroyed. He was hung on a very high gallows, which he put himself up for a Jewish man named Mordecai. I'm going to give you a little bit of background of this book, just to give you a context in which the story comes to us. But let me begin by saying that that it's really a great story itself, a wonderfully, almost perfected story. There are two stories in the Old Testament which are featuring women as the main character, as heroines, and one book is called Book of Ruth, and this one is called Book of Esther. And even those people that may not be necessarily approaching the Bible theologically or spiritually or religiously, even among those who approach the Bible as literature, I've actually heard people say and write that these two stories that we find in the Old Testament, Book of Ruth, Book of Esther, short books, they actually feature what might be considered a perfect story with a great plot development, great climax, and really a very, very vivid characters that makes the story very, very exciting. It's a great drama, I think. My very first opera, as I remember back my childhood, very first opera that I've gone to was actually an opera based on the story Esther. I remember that particular staging, even though I was very young. My father and I went. I don't remember any other members of my family. My father is not necessarily an opera goer, so I'm pretty convinced that he got 2 free tickets. That's why he took me. But anyway, I do remember that this was a story that was brought into a musical kind of opera kind of drama. What's very interesting about the Book of Esther is, now you may find this very interesting, I hope you do, because it's really one of the main points of today's message, is that the name of God or any reference to God never appears in the Book of Esther. Isn't that strange? This is a book in this Bible, as you can see, it's in the Bible, but this particular story, Book of Esther, has no mention of God, not by name, not by anything. So God is not hinted at explicitly in this book. Now, is that a trouble for you? I mean, does this trouble your mind that we have here a book of the Bible, a book in the Bible, but it has no mention of God? I mean, is this an issue? Now, it may be an issue to some. In fact, historically, that was a major issue to certain godly Jews, particularly in the time of the diaspora Jews before Christ, when they were putting together a Greek Tanakh, the Greek Old Testament, because it's like Old Testament was in Hebrew and some Aramaic, and when Jews began to live in diaspora, they needed to translate into a more common language, right? For example, if Bible was only in Hebrew, probably majority of us would not be able to read it, so it'll have to be translated into English, which is a common language for us. Same thing happened in the Old Testament time, right? Or before Christ, I should say. And the book was translated into Greek, and that particular translation is called Septuagint because we are told that it was produced by 70 men, Septuagint. In that particular version of Esther, Septuagint version of Esther, there are references to God in that Greek translation. Because the people who are bringing this together to distribute among the Greek-speaking Jews, they thought that Esther should have some reference to God. So at the end of chapter 4, where Esther says, if I must die, I'll die, right? She makes that determination to go up to the king. And at that very moment, that particular translation inserts a little prayer of Esther to God. And it also mentions in chapter 5, when Esther goes before the king, that there's that little phrase that says, God changed the king's heart. Do you feel cheated that your Bible do not have that? In fact, if you come from a Catholic background, Roman Catholic background, and if you were very serious about Bible reading, and if you remember the details of Catholic Bible, or even Greek Orthodox Bible, these Bibles come from basically a reliance on the Vulgate, which is the Latin version of the Bible, which is a lot taken from the Septuagint version of the Bible. They all have reference to God in the story of Esther. But we don't, because we are very concerned about the purity of the scripture. We're very concerned about the source. What did the original really say? I mean, it's not always absolutely perfectly attainable goal. Well, I guess there's no such thing as a perfect autographer or the original, because we don't have the original. But we're trying to go back as far back as we can to get the most reliable original text of the Bible. And that was the spirit of the Reformation. Reformation cried out ad fonte, back to the source, back to the fountain where everything started. So instead of all these traditions that adds things to it, let's go back to the original and get the actual original statement about what God said. And according to the oldest and the most reliable manuscripts, the book of Esther does not mention God at all. So, what do we make out of that? Well, this is my suggestion, and I hope this is convincing to you, because I really think it should be convincing to most of us and all of us, because it's convincing to me as well very strongly, that this book was written with a very strong intention to bring out a very important theme that gets accentuated, that gets highlighted by this kind of structure. No God mentioned in the story itself, but that does not mean God is absent, obviously. But God is at the background, but not as an inactive being, but God is actually the, if I may use that kind of illustration, God is the director, like director of a movie. God is not one of the characters in the story. But God stands outside of the dramatization of the story by the characters involved in that story. But God is the outside director who's directing every movement of the story. It's intended that way. Why do I think it's intended that way? It's because the theme of Esther is the word pour, or Purim. Because the word pour means chance. It's casting a lot. Where did that come from? Well, it comes from what Haman did, the enemy of Jew. He's sort of the master of overreaction, I think. He overreacts to this anger that he has against this Jewish man named Mordecai. And I'll talk about them a little bit more in a few minutes. And he intended to kill not only Mordecai, but all his race. I'm going to kill all the Jews. And this man, thinking that he has power, all power under heaven. I mean, it was literally so. It was a time of the king Ahasuerus, who was the emperor of this vast empire that went all the way from East Africa all the way to India, it says. This was a vast kingdom, and we are told that Haman is number 2. He's right below the king. And king gave him the signet ring to basically tell him, do whatever you want. I'll condone it because I trust you. And Haman's so convinced that he has such a power to do anything that he wants. So what does he do? He intends to kill all the Jews. He gets the king's approval to write up this edict that would go out to every part of 127 provinces that was under the king. And he would have every Jew killed on the day that he plays into a game now. He makes it into a game. He says, the date. I'm going to cast a lot to choose the date. I mean, that almost sounds like him conceding to so-called a chance or the unknown or even the fate to determine the date, the date when all the Jews will be killed. But I think what he's doing there is an extreme pride, extreme arrogance, where he says, well, I'm just not going to turn this into a game. I'm going to kill all these people on the day when that dice rolls and it falls on a particular day. I'm going to kill everybody on that day. But what he thought was merely a chance, what he thought was just a game, turned out to be fully and perfectly in the hands of the director God. You see, he thought he was just basically playing his game, and it means very little what date it falls on. It's just a chance, and he's just enjoying whatever turn of fate these Jews will find themselves. Of course, that fate in his mind is already determined. They're all going to get killed by him. Who can stop it? Nobody. I'll do it. But that whole thing was actually in the hands of God. He picks a date based on the casting of lot, but that particular date and an additional day next day turned out to be the days when Haman's killed instead, and all the enemies of Jews put down. Because God turned, it says, remember that phrase that we read? For the Jews, sorrow into gladness, from mourning into a holiday. That idea that everything happens by chance and this evil man could turn life into a game and he could do whatever he determined to do, that is totally turned around, upside down, on its own head. Why? Because God may not be seen in the story, but He is the one who's directing everything. And He makes everything happen. Well, in the spirit of having this like a drama, I'm going to give you just a little bit of characterization of the people that involved. I really hope that you will read this book because if you haven't done it already, it's a very interesting book. The main characters are, well, first of all, the woman character is Esther. Esther is supposed to be a beautiful woman. She was chosen out of all the beautiful women of the day. From all parts of the world, and she was chosen because she was the most beautiful and she pleased the king the most. But she actually starts out as a very tragic woman. I mean, she came to the Babylonian exile as a woman who belongs to a defeated nation, a nation that's essentially destroyed. Her parents died early. Perhaps in the war that destroyed the nation of Israel or the people of Judah. When Jerusalem fell, maybe her parents died there as well. But she was raised under the hands of this man named Mordecai. Mordecai happens to be an uncle to Esther. And Mordecai adopts her. And he raised her like a daughter. The name Esther is a Babylonian name. Her Jewish name is Hadassah. I think Hadassah is also a very pretty name. But Esther is actually a very pretty name. It comes from a word which becomes the origin of the English word star. A star. Esther was a star in the sky. So that's a beautiful name. So if there are any Esthers here, that's what your name means. Your name means you're a star. Babylonian star, by the way. But anyway, this she was. And she starts out in the story as a very passive woman. Right? She does what she does because her uncle tells her to do it. Then she's taken into the court. She's groomed in the court to be presented to the king for months. In fact, the whole year is consumed to get her ready, worthy for the king. And she goes through all the process, and she goes before the king, and she has no choice but to just wait for his response. Everything, step by step, she follows the direction of others. But then in chapter 4, there comes that decisive moment when Mordecai comes to her with a story. There is an edict that says all the Jews shall be wiped out. And he says, you are a Jewess woman too. If you think that you will escape this because you're a queen, you are sadly mistaken. God will deliver the Jews in the way that he chooses. But could it be possible that you are made a queen for this moment? That there is a plan of God working out in your life right now, that your job at this very moment is to be that savior for the Jews. And then at that moment she says, well, the reality is if I go up to the king without his permission, in fact, if he doesn't call me first, I cannot go up to him. If I do go up to him, only if he will remove that judgment by allowing me to stand before him, then I can say what I have to say to him. But otherwise, I must die because I presumptuously acted and I went out to the king when I'm not supposed to. So she says, well, even though that is the case, if I die, I die. I will go up to the king. See, from that moment on, Esther becomes a different person. So story has, this book of Esther has stories of her opening up a dinner, a very intimate dinner for the king and Haman. And she doesn't just do a one dinner, but she actually puts together two dinners. And it's almost like tension mounting. There's an escalation of this tension. And finally, the moment comes, she cries out to the king, "Oh, king, save my life, because I am doomed to death." Of course, the king says, "Who's going to kill you? You're my beautiful queen. This evil man, Haman." Right? So he was right there. He thought that he was going to be elevated to this greater, even greater prestige, but his life began to fall even the night before. Some very interesting story happens, which I can't get into. And then she asked the king to not only, reverse the edict. Well, the king can't even reverse his own edict, so he basically says, well, I can't remove what I said already, which was to basically kill the Jews. Then he gives the second edict that says, defend Jews, defend yourself. In fact, another edict that goes on says, you could even attack. That's how the story goes. But she seems like, I don't want to say this because it ruins her beautiful image, but she almost looks kind of bloodthirsty woman at the end. She's going to get everybody. Tens of thousands of people will die because you've been enemies of Jews. Total transformation of the character. Very interesting. wait a minute, the time is that I can't go through all the characters like this. But there is the man named Mordecai, and there's this guy named Haman, and there's this king named Ahasuerus. And Mordecai is another main character. Haman appears as sort of the minor character, the evil character who plays that evil man. Every story needs an evil guy. And something about Haman is that not only is he arrogant, he's very impulsive. And he overreacts to everything, right? So he overreacted, and instead of just perhaps getting rid of Mordecai, whom he really didn't like, because Mordecai was like a real stiff, traditional Jewish man, and he basically stands and he wouldn't bow to anybody, not even to Haman, who was, he's obviously ranked higher than he. He says, no, I'm not going to bow to you. And this is something that turns into a very ugly conflict. And instead of just killing him, Haman overreacts. He says, I'm going to kill all the Jews because I hate Mordecai. And to kill Mordecai among all the Jews, particularly Mordecai, his anger is so deeply burning that he sets up a high gallows, very high gallows, and he made it stand right in front of his own house, turned his house into basically a place to execute capital punishment on somebody. I mean, that I would never do something like that. I think that's really an overreaction. So even when the queen points to Haman, you are the evil man, and king gets so furious, he gets upset, he walks out of the room, and when that happens, guess what Haman does? I mean, this guy, overreaction. Instead of kneeling and bowing or something to beg the queen, please, please, please let me live, he actually throws himself upon her as she's seated, begging her to make him live. But at that very moment, the king walks in. He's even more furious. Get rid of him right away. Would you even try to rape my queen? This man is a man of overreaction, overreaction, an evil man, impulsive. And I think that should say something about how we need to respond in the turn of events that comes about in our own lives. Okay? We'll get into that. Okay, these are some characters that we find in the story. And these characters are important because they're the ones who make the story go. These are the ones that make the story very interesting. And in the story, you have a story of a man who is just outright evil and tries to carry out his evil intention. And then there is a person who is determined, a person who may start out as a very passive person but turns into a proactive individual. All these things are going on. By the way, the king is passive from beginning to the end. He only does what he's told to do. That's very ironic, but that's how the king is portrayed in this story. But the important thing, again, is the director, God himself. It is God who is directing all these characters. But it's a very interesting kind of play because the director is not controlling everyone's personhood. There's a degree of freedom. There's a degree of personal responsibility. There's a degree of everyone having to determine and do what they're supposed to do or what they should do, or even choose to do things that they shouldn't do. All these things are all happening in this story, but somehow God is in control of everything that goes on. Everything. It's a worldview issue. I would call this story basically a story that's based on Christian theism. What we think of God. And that is the basic understanding and the attitude that we need to have as we live our lives on a daily basis. What is the other side or the reversal of this kind of worldview by which you live every day of your life? Is secularism. It's either secular humanism, or I guess these days you could have something called secular Scientism, not that science is bad. I think science and technology can be very useful, but scientism is a philosophy of life, a philosophy of worldview. And scientism basically says only thing that exists are the things that you can observe and see or experimentally discover. Of course, I think perhaps I'm naive in just basically saying that. There are a lot of mysteries to science, but I think that's a healthy science if you say science is also full of mysterious things. But scientism is essentially saying there's no hidden God. There's no director behind the scene. Everything that you see is all there is. Secularism is essentially an idea that God does not exist, or if God does exist, he has nothing to do with life. It's atheistic or deistic. Deistic means, well, if there is a creator, it's like a creator who lets something go. He's maybe a first mover. He moves something, but once it gets moved, then he doesn't do anything. He's hands off. That's like the American ideology. God has no part in the history. God has no part in human drama. God's not doing anything. So everything is up to me. Everything is up to us. Secular humanism says what? Well, I am the decision maker. I am the one who calls all the shots. Haman, essentially, is a secular humanist. I do it. I determine everything. I turn everything into my game because it's all about what I say. Secular without God. Secular. But here's a very serious situation that we find ourselves in. That is, to many Christians, to many people who call themselves Christians, we can be functional secularists. Because if we took God out of our lives, very little will change. You will still do everything as you do. You decide everything as you do. You act as you always have done, because you have become a functional secularist. I don't have God. I don't need God, because I figure everything out as I do it now. Oh, that's a very important question, isn't it? I mean, it's not, the worldview or philosophy of life. All these things are, perhaps it's fun or even interesting to talk about them, but if they have no real bearing upon our own lives, I mean, it's a detached idea. We could all say we follow Christian theism, but what if we say we are Christians, yet we are living a secular life? God doesn't really exist in our entertainment. God doesn't exist in my daily decisions, my relationship, my studies, my work. I don't think differently because I'm a believer in God. I basically do everything like those who say there's no God. But Bill Edgar said in his book on Lord's Prayer, something I think is very insightful. But there is God. Where is God? God is in the gaps. That is what? The things that I find needs. There's God. I'm in trouble. I get sick. Some hardship comes upon my life. I lose my job. I have issues with my friends, or something's going on in the church. Gaps appear in my life, and that's where God seems to be. Okay? I need God. Why? Because he needs to fix my problem, because I have this problem. Otherwise, I don't need him. Goodbye. You've done your job. Leave me alone. Okay? So you could be a Christian, and you may be living in the story of Esther as a character, but if you did not know what God is doing and really did not believe that God is the one who is moving everything, if you lived as if everything is determined by you and it depends on you, then you could be living a very secularist life. That is a very, very important lesson. Very important lesson. What is God doing in this story? God is a masterful director. There's a lot of meaning in this. These are not just sequences and series of events or conversations, but everything moves to a meaningful story or perhaps conclusion. Like, any movie or any drama you might see, you find every detail interesting. Why? Because they contribute to the overall meaning of the story. It's not just events, it's not just action sequences that you see. I mean, I guess you could love a movie because it has a lot of good actions, but that can essentially, ultimately that does not satisfy. You need a meaningful resolution. You walk away from that movie feeling like, oh, I got that story. That's a great story. You need that meaning, and that meaning is brought together by God. I hear that sometimes actors or actresses could be acting out a scene. I've never been in that position really, but there are segments of scenes that are taken, but each segment may not be done sequentially, meaning actor or actress could be acting something out, but having acted out, that person may not know the full story. I'm just acting, but where does this fit in? Maybe it's the job of the director and later the editor to put it all together. Sometimes our lives like that. In fact, a lot of it is like that, right? We don't really know where this seems to be going in a smaller scale. We know the full story, the big story, but we don't know what's next. But we trust that God is the one who has everything planned out, and He's leading me along the way. Story of Esther is a beautiful story of the great turnaround. At the worst time, God steps in, and the people are delivered. The Purim is so significant because it's a day that is characterized by the worst, but that worst day turns into the best day for the Jews, the worst to the best. That huge turnaround, right? Reversal, the great reversal. And in that sense, the book of Esther is really about God's grand drama of redemption. From beginning to the end, God's great drama that has the climax of Jesus Christ, the morning star, the great morning star. Appearing, He comes and He dies at the cross, on the cross, but this Jesus is raised back to life and into glory in the heavenly place. Death and resurrection of Jesus Christ is the great Christian message. And what you have in the book of Esther is a smaller version or the reflection or the shadow of the great story. In this short story, God let the story, the great story of God's redemption for us to be placed in this story as a little slice. You taste what's going on. In it, you see how God can turn the worst into the best. And He's done it. Not only for the Jews in the book of Esther, but He's done it for the entire chosen people, you and me, through Jesus Christ, the true Esther. And Jesus didn't just say, if I die, I die. He died. But He rose again. Let me close by saying, then what? What do we do? Okay, we get it. The story is about a worldview. That things happen not purely by chance. In fact, no man is the master of his or her own destiny. It is God who is in the background of all things. In fact, He is proactively involved in the history itself. And what we have here is a smaller version of the great drama that God is directing, where Jesus Christ is the main actor, main person who lives, but yet lives, who dies but yet lives. He's the one who gives his life as that seed falls to the ground. But because of his sacrifice, he saves many, all of us. What about us? What are we to do? Well, I'm going to just read a verse in chapter 4, because this really is a beautiful worldview declaration. It's Mordecai speaking to Esther. Okay, I hinted at this a little bit, but verse 13. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther. Okay, so he's speaking through a messenger. Do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. You see what Mordecai is saying? Mordecai is saying, I believe in God's prophecy. I believe in what God has said through Jeremiah. I believe that God will restore us to Jerusalem after 70 years. I know what God said about the redemption history to be fulfilled through the line of the Jews, that there will be a Messiah who will come to deliver all God's people throughout the world. So he's declaring that, isn't he? He's saying, well, Jews will not end here. You know, no matter what Haman thinks, that he could completely eradicate Jews, the answer is no. This will never happen in God's drama. Why? Because God already said what he's going to do about us. We shall be delivered. We shall be restored. So the deliverance will come for us regardless of what you do, Esther. God will deliver us. What does that say? Well, that says to us, well, whatever you do, really, whatever I choose to do, I can never enhance, in a true sense, or thwart God's intention, God's drama, God's work of redemption. God will do what he does. God is God. I am not God. I cannot replace God. God will do what he will do. But what if God has chosen you to be the actor and the actress to play this part out, to bring about God's drama? Well, it's going to be done regardless. If God cannot use you, God will use somebody else. But what if you are placed where you are placed? Esther, what if God made you the queen now of all times? That in this very critical moment for the Jews, that you are the queen next to the king, the most powerful man in the entire world. What if God is the one who set you where you are for the time such as this? Well, if God delivers us, he will deliver us. Without you, he will do it. But what if you are there because God intends to bring something out of you at this very important time? Isn't this a beautiful lesson for us? Life is a gift from God. We have our part to play, not because we are, really, seriously, we're not absolutely replaceable. I mean, you think the world will stop going around if you didn't exist? God will do what he will do. But what if you are where you are because God has a part that you need to play? What do you think? Are you going to say, yes, God, if I die, I die. I'll do it for Or are you somehow in a delusion that the world is all about you and you're going to make up your own story without God? This morning, a gentleman came to our first service. First time in a long while. He hasn't been coming to church at all. In fact, his family, a beautiful family. The rest of the family members are very faithful members of church. But he came this morning on his own will. I mean, this was his desire to be here. But I knew that he was coming because his wife told me Sunday before, my husband's going to come to church. He's having a health crisis. Young man, huge surprise. At one level, it is life-threatening. I don't know the full story. I don't know the full extent. But there was a particular procedure done, and he's kind of waiting, what next? So I sat with him in the back this morning after service. I said, I want to pray for you. And we all sat there and prayed together. And this is what he said. He said, well, if what you say is right, that God is really doing all this, I mean, it's all up to God. Either I live or I die. It's all up to God. What can I do? I just need to accept that. And he was declaring that he was at peace with that because it's not under his control. It's God. Right? Right? So my answer to him was this. Okay, well, that's right at one level. But what it sounds to me like you're saying is not a statement of faith. It's a statement of fate. It's a fatalism. All you're saying is what God does, he will do. So I have no part in it. But I'm going to tell you this. God is a personal God. It's right. Whether you live or die, yes, it's in God's hands. But I want to see this, the whole thing in play. Who are you? There is this weight of your own person being meaningful in relation to other people, all bearing down on you. Look at your wife sitting next to you. As she prays, she's crying, she's bawling, she's like a mess. Why? Because she loves you. And she's looking at you and saying, this is my husband. Yes, this is your wife. You have a beautiful wife to take care of. You have beautiful children to take care of. We Christians, we have the church we're part of. We have people to one another. We are called to love each other. So it's not just about God doing everything and he will do whatever he wants to do. Yes, God has power and determination to carry on his business. He will do it whether with me or without me. But at the moment, God deals with me not as a pawn. He's not dealing with me like a thing. He's not dealing with me like a little rock on the road that God could just kick away if God desires so. No, he's treating me like a being, person, because God is a personal God. What God desires is a personal relationship, personal love. I have a job to do. I need to love my wife. I need to love my children. I need to love my church. I need to do what I can to bring the gospel to the ends of the earth. I need to do the things responsibly. Sometimes things are hard and difficult. I feel like giving up. But I can't. Why? Because what if God placed you where you are just for the time like this? It's God's work, but you have a place. So we can't just give up. We can't just say, I don't care. You have to care because God cares. Well, let's pray. I would like you to pray for a moment. Like, don't just walk away or just let your mind go. Focus a little bit, because prayer is like that. Prayer is focusing your mind on God. Don't just listen, whether you were able to get a lot out of this or perhaps it was a little over I don't know. But one thing that you need to do now is what you heard needs to be processed through prayer in conversation with God. God hears you in Jesus Christ, this great director. Yet he's invisible to our physical eyes. But he's real. He's the one who directs your life. You may be in a tough time right now, but that's not the end of the story. In fact, for Christians, it's comedy, because the end is going to be brilliant. Never a tragedy. Any kind of tragedies that happen in the middle of the story is just there to have it reversed. Christian story never ends with a cross. It always ends with a resurrection and glory. So you may be in a period of real hardship and struggle, but don't just sit there and say, whatever. No, God has a wonderful place for you. When you can't do anything, pray. When you are facing a real difficulty, think about how you can love somebody better. Instead of the hardship of the situation tearing you apart, let it be an opportunity for you to be a support to one another. Love your children, not as if you have designed their lives and you got everything perfectly planned out for them and everything's going to happen the way you want them to be. Sorry, you're going to be disappointed. If not this way, at least that way. Because they're not yours, they're God's. But when they look straight to your eyes with their wondering souls, don't you know that you are there to look straight into their eyes and affirm to them, you are God's children. God has a purpose for your life. He loves you so much more than I could ever love you. You are there, brothers and sisters, for a reason. Would you ask the Lord to bless you in search and execution of the reasons for which you exist in this great drama of God? Our great God, coming under this exceptionally beautifully written drama, but a historical drama, we are reminded again how you are the sovereign God. There's no such thing as a human manipulation of chance. In fact, there's no such thing as chance. In your world, you are the mover of all things. And in that great directorship, we are called to live our part as wise, as faithful, committed people. Lord, would you bless our hearts to discover more and more our place in this life and give you glory for all that we are called to do, and do them beautifully for the sake of your glory. In Jesus' name.